But as we will see, nothing is technical. There's always deep meaning within the specifics of the law. So again, the first half talks about, it's almost like a fill-in. All the details that were not explained in last week's parsha are reiterated and clarified in this week's parsha. That's the first half of the parsha. The second half of the parsha discusses what they call the Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, the 7 days of inauguration. And the temple the tabernacle was formally built on the 1st of Nisan, on the 1st of the Hebrew month, on the first day of the first Hebrew month of Nisan. And that day is going to be the day that God formally dwells amongst the Jewish people. We'll read about it next week, not really next week because it's the holiday, but in 2 weeks, that's the 8th day, Vayom Hashmini, the 8th day. But it's not really the 8th day, it's the 1st of Nisan, but it's the 8th day because it follows 7 days of inauguration. And the second half of this parsha discusses the details of the 7 days of inauguration, all the offerings and the rituals that the sons of Aaron did in order to prepare themselves for the formal dwelling of the divine presence in the temple, which would be on the 8th day, which would be the 1st of Nisan. So the 7 days of inauguration start the 23rd of Adar, the last 7 days of the month of Adar. Okay, that is that. So if you look at this parsha from the perspective of what I just read, very technical, a lot of specific laws, not too much inspiration. But that's why we're here, so we can dig up beneath the surface and find the relevance and the meaning to our daily lives. Just one more word about the 7 days of inauguration. The Kabbalists explain that the 7 days of inauguration, why 7 days? Because what it's really doing, it's correcting the 7 days of creation. You see, God created the world in 7 days. And the purpose of creation was that God should have in the language of the Medrash, God should have a dwelling place for himself on this earth. So God wants a vacation home. God's in heaven, but in heaven you get tired. So God needs a home on this earth. So God creates the earth and then hopes that God can coexist with the human being in the Garden of Eden. And that was a wonderful plan. It was a very short honeymoon. It lasted a few hours. And then it failed because the people sin. And when the people sin, they metaphorically, they expel God from earth. And God ascends to the heaven. And then it takes a few thousand years. But what's the purpose of the Jewish people leaving Egypt and getting the Torah? The purpose is to build the temple. What's the building of a temple? It's a figurative expression of bringing God back into our lives. Okay? So we're bringing God back into our lives. When we do so, we are correcting the 7 days of creation. And it's interesting that the Hebrew word for inauguration in the Hebrew is miluim. Miluim, in modern Hebrew, if you want to go to, when you go to the army reserves in Israel, you go to miluim, to fill in your quota. So it's to fill in, to fill up. So miluim is to fill to fill the void, so to speak. So the commentaries explain, the Kabbalists explain that through the 7 days of inauguration, as preparation for erecting the temple, what we're really doing is we are correcting the 7 days of creation and bringing the 7 days of creation to its fulfillment, to its wholesomeness by fulfilling the purpose of creation, by bringing God into the world through making the temple, both the physical temple, but maybe more importantly, the figurative temple in the heart of every person. So that's just something about the 7 days of inauguration. That's the second half of the parsha. Now we can go back to the beginning and see if we can connect this, see what's going on here, look at some of the details and find some of the meaning. So here it goes. So there is an interesting description in the beginning of the parsha, and that is about in the morning, the first ritual that was done in the temple. So imagine it's the morning, it's dawn, and what's the first thing we do in the temple during the day? So the Torah describes it. The Torah says that the first thing you do is that the priest would go in, he would climb the altar and do what they call Trumat HaDeshen. Trumat HaDeshen means taking sort of lifting up some of the ashes that were on the altar and removing them from the altar. Now, it's not to get a cleaning job done. You see, some people, they want to clean the house before they go to sleep. So they wake up in the morning, they have a clean house. So you would expect the cleaning of the temple to be done the night before. But it doesn't really work that way because the fire burnt all night, and there were leftover parts of the animal that were burnt if there were a lot of offerings that were burnt all night. So the fire is burning all night. In the morning, there are ashes. So you sort of want to clean up the temple. You want to remove the ashes. But that's the conventional interpretation. But that interpretation does not stand up to scrutiny. The purpose cannot be to clean up, because if the purpose is to clean up, they should actually remove all the ashes, but they didn't remove all the ashes. What they did is they just took a little symbolic portion. Truma literally means sort of an uplifting of a gift. They pick up a little bit, a shovel full of ashes, and they take it, and they don't take it outside the temple. They put it beside the altar. So why are we doing this? Now, what do they do with the rest of the ashes? The rest of the ashes, they would actually combine it and make it into a big pile in the center of the altar, and that was seen to me sort of beautiful, how there's so much going on here, there's so much activity, there's so many ashes. When that got too big, they would take all those ashes out and take it outside the camp. But that's not the daily ritual. The daily ritual is you enter the temple, you take a little bit of the ashes, they send one priest on behalf of the congregation, on behalf of the community, you take a little bit of ashes, and you take it and you put it beside the altar. Why is this so important? In fact, it's so important that in the daily prayer, before we pray, we read the verses of the offerings. We call it korbanot. We read the verses of the offerings that were of the daily offerings to commemorate the daily offerings in the temple. And in the prayer book, one of the things we say every morning is this portion, the portion of Trumat HaDeshen, the portion of removing the ashes. Somehow or another, the first thing you do, you know what you do the first thing in the morning. You say Modani, you thank God, it's wonderful. But the first thing sort of sets the tone of the day. So what's the tone? What are we setting here? We're saying you come into the temple, the first and most important thing you need to do today is remove the ashes. And the question is, of course, what does that mean and what does that signify? So believe it or not, like everything else in Judaism, there are many, many interpretations. We'll start with one or two, connect it to Passover, and then we'll see from there. So the first interpretation is as follows. The first interpretation is you have to ask yourself, what do the ashes signify? Ashes signify that which was burnt yesterday. So in some sense, what we're saying is the first thing you need to do today in the temple, the first thing you need to do today in the service of God is remove the concept of yesterday. In other words, yesterday represents what happened yesterday. Yesterday, you were perfect compared to what you could have been yesterday. You were as wise, as kind, as holy as you could have been yesterday. What's today? What's the first thing you need to do after you're approaching your task of building a temple for God, of bringing holiness into the world? The first thing you need to do is not to be trapped with the person I was yesterday, with the limitation of yesterday. So what do? I say I have to remove the ashes of yesterday because today is a new experience, right? So many people walk around the world and they're traumatized or affected by past experiences. Yesterday I tried and failed, so today I'm not going to try, right? That would mean being stuck within the ashes. The ashes represents the accumulated effort of yesterday. And even if yesterday was perfect for what yesterday could have been, but the message here is every day is a new day. Every day a person has new potential. Every day a person has new opportunities. So don't view yourself from the lens of yesterday. View yourself as from the perspective of renewal, that you could become today whatever you want to become. You're not limited within the person you were yesterday. And that's why it's so important that the first thing we need to do is, who am I today? I wake up and that's limited by my accomplishments yesterday, and I'm not the person necessarily traumatized by the traumas of yesterday. I'm traumatized, but I'm not limited by that. I can overcome that. And that's why it's so important that the first thing we need to do is, it's a new me, it's a new you. I'm not the person I was yesterday. Of course, that's very, very, very relatable to the whole concept of Passover, of matzah, of freedom, which we said this many times over the past couple of days, that matzah is limitation. And my greatest limitation is limitation of self. In other words, limitation of my own boundaries, the boundaries that I create in my mind, limiting myself. I say, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm bad at. This I'm going to try. This I'm not going to try. I'm all sort of boxing myself into what I could do, limiting what I could do or what I can't do based on what? Based on past experience. So what are we saying? We're saying past experience. The first thing you need to do to serve God is remove the ashes, because the ashes were good for yesterday. Again, we're not all negative. We're not saying you were a bad person yesterday. Yesterday you were perfect for yesterday. But if today you'll be as perfect as yesterday, then what do you need today for? Then you had yesterday. If God gives you a new day, it's because you have new opportunities. You should not be the same person you were yesterday. And that is the significance of the removing of the ashes as the first ritual, the first service of the day of the temple. And that's how it relates to the concept of Passover, which is freedom, which is climbing out of my own limitation. And again, most limitations that I have in my life, at least I'll speak for myself, are not imposed from the outside, but they are internal. It's limitations that I impose upon myself based on my perspective, based on my projections, based on my fears, based on my past experiences. But the idea of the removing of the ashes is saying, this is new. I'm a new person. I'm not limited to the person I was. I'm not limited to the person I was yesterday. Okay, that's one idea, because there's more to say about this, and we'll say it, but for a moment, if anybody wants to mention something, I'll open up the floor. Otherwise, we continue. If anybody wants to jump in, otherwise we continue. Okay, next. Let's think about another angle of the ashes, because we know every concept in the Torah has many perspectives. Sages say that there are at least 70 interpretations for everything in the Torah. So we're going to try to give another angle, a little bit more psychological, but also related to Passover. You see, the week before the Passover, anything, you open up the commentaries, everything the commentaries are writing, they're already in the mood of Passover. So there's a lot of overlap between the themes of this parsha and the themes of Passover. Okay, so let's think about ashes. So the first, again, let's put the previous interpretation aside, because the previous interpretation is going to distract us from understanding the new interpretation. Then when you finish the class, you go back and you see which interpretation you like better. But for now, you have to come to this question as a blank slate. What is the concept of ashes? What does it mean? Forget about what I said earlier. Later on, you can go back and revisit. Okay, so what is the ashes? The ashes is the byproduct of the fire. Fire, presumably, is something good. Fire is inspiration, right? The Torah talks about it. Again, the opening statement of this parsha is that there has to be a continuous fire on the altar. Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tichbeh. If you go to most Ashkenazic shuls, and I think most Ashkenazic shuls, you will see that they have in the beginning and the front of the shul, they have what they call, in the front of the synagogue, they have what they call a ner tamid, an everlasting candle, however they name it in English. That is that's to commemorate this commandment at the beginning of this parsha, where it says, Eish tamid, there should be an eternal fire on the altar. So to commemorate the eternal fire on the altar, they have the ner tamid, the eternal candle. Now, all the commentaries explain that the concept is very interesting. You have to have fire on the altar always. Why do you need fire on the altar always? It's not utilitarian. It's not that you need the fire to fulfill a function. The menorah is to fulfill a function, to give light. The fire on the altar is to consume the sacrifices. But what happens if there's no sacrifices to consume? So the Torah is saying, no, you have to have a fire regardless of the sacrifices. In other words, there is a spiritual concept of having fire continuous, and you have to feed the fire. And the sages take it even further, and they say that on the altar, in the temple, on the altar, the altar was very big. It was a big surface. It was 32 amma by 32 amma, 32 cubits by 32 cubits, which means at least 32 feet by 32 feet, maybe even double that. So there's a very large surface. And the sages explain, they deduce it from these verses, that there's not one fire, there are multiple fires, sometimes up to 5 fires. And every fire had a different function. And there was one fire that was continuously burning that had no other function. The only function of the fire was to fulfill the commandment to have an everlasting fire. So there's something about fire. Now, this is easy to explain. Fire represents passion and inspiration. So if you're going to serve God, if you're going to come in, if you're going to enter your temple, your your figurative temple, and you want to serve God and fulfill your purpose of creation and do the right thing and bring holiness into the world, a very important ingredient is fire. And you have to have the passion. Without the passion, it's not going to work. The Rebbe once said a story to explain this. He said, once upon a time, there was a blacksmith. And back in the day, in the old country, or even in this country, before the era of cars, blacksmith was very important because it was like the gas station, because you had to make the horseshoes. And if you're riding in your horse and wagon and the horseshoe breaks you, or your wagon breaks, you need a blacksmith. So it's actually a good business. So there was this mentor trying to teach his student how to the secrets of the trade of how to be a blacksmith. And he tells him all the details. And he shows him how to bend the metal and how to put the metal in the fire. Everything is fine. He teaches him every step of the way. And the guy is a very good student. And he takes notes and he writes every step by step exactly how to be a good blacksmith. Then after the first day in business, he comes back to his teacher and he said, I failed. Nothing happened. It didn't work. So the mentor said, what happened? He tried to debrief him. And indeed, he followed all the steps. All the steps were done. So he said, what happened? That's trying to investigate. Finally, he realized what happened. He forgot to tell him that you have to light the fire. Because to be the blacksmith, you need the fire. So he told him everything to do once the fire is lit, but he forgot to say you have to light the fire. And that's the Hasidic story to tell you that you can go through the motions, but the motions are not going to affect what they need to affect fully unless you have the Aish, the fire, the eternal fire, the passion, the longing, the love to God. And that is what's represented by the fire on the altar. Okay, so now we know the fire on the altar. So what's the ashes? So the ashes is the byproduct of the fire. What's the byproduct of the fire? So let's assume something that's left over. It's not as holy as the fire. It's not as positive as the fire. It's the ashes. So what's the byproduct of the fire? So the byproduct of the fire is a sense of longing, a sense of sadness. You know, and holiness is related to happiness. So sadness is problematic. It's part of life, but it's problematic. Why do I say that the byproduct of love is sadness? Is because there are different forms of love, but at least the love that we're talking about right now is a love of longing. I have a great deep desire to connect to God because I feel a distance. And if I'm longing for someone, I'm lovesick, I'm yearning for someone, but I can't ultimately carry out that bond because, again, God is infinite and I'm finite. I'm yearning for someone who's in Australia. So the love is a great inspiration. But ultimately, there's a certain sadness because love includes longing, and the longing has not been satisfied. So there's a certain built-in sadness. Now, when you look at the fire, you don't necessarily feel the sadness. What you see is the passionate love. It looks beautiful, and it's very inspirational. But what happens is after a while, once the fire subsides, you're left with a certain sense of longing. I'm distant from the object of my love. And that is sort of ashes. It's the byproduct of love. It could bring a person to sadness. I'm trying to feel close to God. I'm making an effort to connect to the spiritual side of life. I'm longing for it. I'm yearning for it. But ultimately, not always do I feel that I actually have achieved it. It's like I'm yearning for someone who's on the other side of the globe, and I have a deep love and a deep longing. But ultimately, that longing can also bring about a little bit, a byproduct of sadness. Okay, how do we view this sadness? Is this sadness good or bad? So the answer is, it's not as good, it's not as inspiring as the fire. But the Torah says, when you start the day, lift up the ashes, don't throw it in the garbage, don't take it outside the camp, put it next to the altar. It is also valuable, it's also holy, it's also good. In other words, even though we try to serve God with joy, as the verse says, King David says, Idu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. But there's a certain element of sadness that is inevitable, and it's also holy in the sense that even though that's not the goal, but it could be used for something good, and we'll explain. To explain this, we'll jump right into Passover, because Passover, we also have the element of sadness and bitterness. Where do you have the element of sadness and bitterness by Passover? Of course, it's the bitter herbs. So we're trying to commemorate freedom. We're trying to commemorate the concept that God took us out of Egypt and now we're a free people. How do we do so? By bringing up the bitter herbs, bringing up the trauma. I mean, it's a horrible thing. Can you imagine? Imagine someone comes out of oppression and we say, we're going to celebrate your redemption. What are we going to do? We're going to reenact the pain, right? The psychologist would say, this is crazy, right? It's malpractice. Why are you bringing up the trauma again? So obviously what Judaism is telling us is that sadness is not the goal, but sometimes, okay, I have to recreate the terms. I'm going to say maror, which is Hebrew for bitterness. And bitterness is not good, is not the goal, but sometimes bitterness is actually a great motivator to freedom, to change, to growth. And here we'll go to the language of the Kabbalah, which explains that in Hebrew, it doesn't really translate in English perfectly, but there's sadness and there's bitterness. And sadness is a feeling of sadness that depletes one of energy. That's how we define sadness. In other words, that's how we define the Hebrew word for atzvut. That's one form of sadness, which is always negative. Sadness that depletes me of energy. And then there's what they call bitterness. And bitterness, mirirut, again, not to be confused with the English word bitterness, but what the Hebrew language means when it uses the term mirirut, it's bitterness, but not without energy. To the contrary, I'm so bitter, I'm so upset, I am so irritated by the negativity that I'm motivated to change. I'm motivated to create a revolution, right? The people who are upset at the status quo and make a revolution, they're bitter people, right? But do they not have energy? No, they have a tremendous amount of energy. So they do have maror, they do have the bitterness. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that God is showing us at the Seder that bitterness, the feeling of being unsatisfied, is not the goal. The goal is to feel free, not to feel unsatisfied. But there are times when the feeling of dissatisfaction can actually be a great motivator and fuel to freedom. And that's why we actually use it as part of the spiritual process of the Seder to create freedom, because bitterness could be a tool to freedom, not sadness, meaning to say not if you're depleted of energy, that would never lead to anything good. But if it's a bitterness, it's a dissatisfaction that is full of energy and full of life and could be a motivator to change, then in fact it's good to be dissatisfied, because again, satisfaction ultimately would not allow for growth. The motivator for growth is I'm unhappy with my situation as it is right now. Going back to the ashes in the temple. So the second interpretation of what the ashes represent is the Torah is telling you, let's say you have a love to God. Let's say you long to God. There's going to be a byproduct. The byproduct is ultimately you cannot fully, at least in this life, you cannot fully unite with the subject of your beloved. Ultimately you cannot feel one with the infinite creator, maybe in the afterlife, but not in this life. So there is going to be a certain sense of bitterness, of sadness, a bitterness that comes along with the longing. Love like fire, right? The Song of Songs calls it cholat ahava. I am love sick. Person is love sick. He's completely thinking about the person he loves, and he can't do anything else. And if he cannot unite with that person, there's a certain sense of sickness, of bitterness. But the Torah is telling you that is sweet. That's ashes. That's holy. It's not ashes that have to be expelled from the temple. They're supposed to be placed next to the altar. That's not the goal. The goal is to reunite with God. The goal is to feel the passion and the love and the joy. But part of living on this earth is going to include having that byproduct, and that byproduct is holy. Why is it holy? Not because it is the value for itself, but it's like the maror, like the bitter herbs of the Seder. It's supposed to generate further growth and further inspiration to cleave to God. So don't underestimate the ashes, because the ashes, the bitterness, the longing is actually maybe counterintuitively, but it is part of the process of freedom, part of the process of growth, part of the process of joy. Okay, so if anybody wants to comment or disagree or protest or light a fire or create some ashes, whatever you want to do, now is the time.
I have an observation that fire is one of the things it is a great transformer. It transforms one thing into another. And ashes are also a great fertilizer of the next thing.
I agree. Are ashes fertilizer?
Yes.
They are.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Rabbi, I've got two fundamental questions.
Yes.
One, we were talking about the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, eternal fire. Why doesn't Chabad shul? Why don't Chabad shuls have one of those? And I've got another follow-up question.
The short answer. You want the long answer or the short answer?
Short answer. You can tell me the long answer offline.
Short answer is I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. My second question.
The long answer is that there's many Ashkenazi customs that the Hasidic community didn't adopt. For example, when you go to most shuls and the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Law, it says that next to where the Chazan stands, you're supposed to write the verse Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. I place God before me always. So the Chazan standing before God should always have this meditation that he's standing before God. Now the Hasidic movement, the Hasidic community didn't adapt that custom because they said you have to inscribe, I place God before me always. You have to inscribe it not on the board in front of the Chazan, but you have to inscribe it in your mind and heart. So in other words, there's two types of temples. Some shuls are supposed to are trying to create an environment of a sort of a beautiful building that will elicit inspiration from the people entering. That's one type of shul. There's another shul, what the Hasidim would call a shtibel. It's also a house. It's a house people get together. It's what they call in Yiddish, it's more hamish, it's more homey. And that's really what the Hasidic shuls were like. So they didn't really invest in the symbols of the temple as has been done in the Ashkenazic communities. So, but again, I'm not, God forbid, not putting down the custom. It's a beautiful custom. That's the long answer.
Thank you. Back to the Torah portion. You mentioned that there might be as many as 5 fires going on at a given time.
Yes.
We're wandering through the desert. There are no trees. What are they burning?
So 5 fires was in the times of the temple when they came to Jerusalem. Okay. That was a much larger temple. The temple in the desert, the altar in the desert was much smaller. The dimensions were much smaller. What were they burning? They were burning wood. They had wood. You see that they built the temple. They built the Mishkan, the altar, out of cedar wood. They brought cedar wood from Egypt. There's a whole interesting medrash about that. Mm-hmm. And I presume they had wood for fire as well. I also presume that the medrash says this, that if you have a market of 600,000 Jews traveling through the desert, there were people, entrepreneurs, who came to sell merchandise to this market, right? If you knew that the 600,000 people that have nothing, there are no shops, there are no stores, you can come and you can be their Amazon. So there's going to be somebody who's going to approach them and sell merchandise. So it wasn't like the Jewish people, like we think of wandering in the desert. They were wandering, but they weren't lost. And also, if you actually track the route of the Jewish people in the desert, you see that they weren't necessarily that far from civilization. They weren't like in the center of the desert. So there was some interaction with the merchants of the neighboring countries, even though Amazon was down then.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll continue our journey about the various details of the offerings that the Torah elaborates upon in this week. Again, like I said, much of this parsha is more like sort of a fill-in, I should say. Because the categories of offerings have been explained last week, and this week we sort of add details about the various offerings. So we mentioned the sin offering, we mentioned the elevation offering, we mentioned other offerings. Just to say, so let's talk a little bit about the Thanksgiving offering, because Thanksgiving offering is one offering that's just mentioned in this parsha. It was not mentioned in the last parsha. The Thanksgiving offering is a subcategory of what they call the peace offering. Peace offering is an offering. Okay, let's run through the categories quickly. We'll give 3 categories. There's 3 general categories. There's the olah, which is called an elevation offering. You brought the olah, the entire animal after being slaughtered was offered on the temple. That was sort of a that signified a person wanting to become close to God, a person wanting to ascend, a person wanting to go up. If you feel you want to connect to God, you brought an elevation offering. That was one category. Then you had another category, which is sin offering. So if I commit a certain specified sins and I want atonement, so I brought a sin offering. And then there was a strange offering called shlamim, called peace offering. And that's a celebration offering. It's a very interesting offering. I'm told that in the cultures around Israel at the time, this offering was unheard of, because here you bring an offering to the temple, and part of the offering is offered on the altar, part of the offering is eaten by the priests, and then part of the offering you take home and you have a steak. Okay, and this is very strange. It's a very Jewish idea that you could serve God not by sacrificing of your own possessions and giving it to the priest and giving it to the altar, but the way you serve God is actually by eating the meat, by internalizing the meat, by making a celebration. It's a very Jewish concept. It's an unusual in the ancient world at the time. So that's what they call the peace offering. It's called the peace offering, amongst other reasons, because it makes everybody happy. It makes God happy. It makes the priest happy, and it makes the person bringing the Israelites bringing the offering. It makes him happy too, because he gets steak. He gets some steak. He doesn't have to go to the steakhouse. He gets the steak of the temple. Okay. Now the peace offering is more lenient. You have more time to eat the peace offering. The rules are a little bit relaxed. It's not so intense. However, there's this category of the peace offering that is introduced in this parsha, and that's called the Thanksgiving offering. And the Thanksgiving offering is one of those offerings that sort of breaks all the models. It's a little bit strange. But in short, if a miracle happened, I want to thank God, I bring a form of a peace offering. What's better than peace offering? God has saved me. I'm going to give some meat to God, some meat to the priest, and some meat to myself. Okay. But once you start looking at the details of the peace offering, everything goes crazy. So the first thing, usually, the offering is just you have to eat a piece of meat. Fine. A big piece of meat. If it's a big animal, you have a lot of meat to eat. With the peace offering, with the Thanksgiving offering, not only do you have to eat the flesh of the animal, but you also have to eat it with bread. You ready? You have to have 40 loaves of bread. Imagine someone tells you, okay, here's dinner. You're getting a piece of steak, plus you're getting 40 bagels, right? It's crazy. Now, not only do you have to eat 40 loaves of 40 loaves of bread, you also have less time to eat it. Typically, the peace offering you could eat for 2 days and the night in between. So if today is Thursday morning and I bring a peace offering on Thursday morning, I could eat the offering on Thursday night, and all of Friday. When the sun sets on Friday, I cannot eat it anymore. So I have 2 days and one night in between. The Thanksgiving offering, I have less time. If I bring it on Thursday morning, I can only eat it on Thursday and on Thursday nights. I have 1 day and one night instead of 2 days and 2 nights, instead of 2 days and one night. So why am I giving you all this detail? Because it's just strange. The Torah gives you so much food, 40 loaves of bread, and actually cuts down the time that you have to eat it. So I say, okay, today what's for supper today? Today we're going to eat a sheep, and we're going to eat 40 loaves of bread. So there's some sort of joke here, right? What's the Torah doing? I mean, what's the joke? What's the punchline? What's the catch? Like this, what's the meaning of all of this? So the commentaries explain something very simple. The commentaries say the Torah has an agenda here. What's the Torah's agenda? The Torah's agenda is that you should get out of your house and invite the neighborhood. One person can't eat 40 loaves of bread. You can't eat an animal in 1 day. So built into the Thanksgiving offering is the concept that don't celebrate alone. If God performs a miracle for you, if you're really joyous, if you're really happy, don't celebrate alone, but you have to invite others. Now we understand why you have 40 loaves of bread and why you have less time. It's almost forcing you, right? Because you're not supposed to leave over the meat of the sacrifice. If you do, you have to burn it. It's not so simple. You're not supposed to leave it. It's one of the 613 commandments is not to allow the offering to extend, not to be eaten by the time it has to be consumed. Okay? So a person is going to try to eat everything, but I can't eat it alone by definition. So therefore, the Torah is basically telling me that I have to go and I have to invite my neighbors and I have to invite my friends. Okay. Why do I have to? What's the deeper message here? The deeper message here is as follows. The concept of joy. What is joy? If you think about joy and Thanksgiving, a person feels happy. The feeling of joy is basically when the soul feels like it's transcending its limitation. You see, let's forget about the body for a second. Let's look at the soul. What does the body want? Body wants pleasure. That's what the body wants. Pleasure you can have alone. You can have pleasure alone. What does the soul want? The soul, because it's infinite, the soul feels almost trapped in our daily existence. And what the soul wants to feel free. And how do you feel free if you're a soul? If you transcend yourself. If I go beyond myself, if I feel I'm connecting to others, all of a sudden the soul feels free. The soul feels like it has oxygen. And that's why you see a very interesting thing. When a person is really happy, it's very happy to be happy alone. It's very hard to be happy alone. If you're happy, you want to get up and you want to dance, right? If you're sad, you want to stay in bed. You don't want to see anybody. But joy, it's very hard to do joy because the whole concept of joy is the soul is bursting out of its seams. It's bursting out of its limitation. It's bursting out of its body. It's trying to connect to others. That's what the definition of joy is, and that's what the soul wants. So when the Torah says that if you're feeling thankful, if you're feeling happy, invite your neighbors to eat with you, the Torah is telling you how to achieve, this is a big question, how do I achieve joy? How do I feel grateful, right? Because we know, and we can elaborate upon this if we have time, but ultimately, the only way you can be joyful is being grateful. If a person is ungrateful, person feels like whatever they have, they deserve, and therefore they want more, and therefore they don't appreciate what they have, so they're going to rob themselves of any sense of joy. Joy is predicated upon being grateful. But to be joy is predicated upon to be grateful. So the Torah is telling you, if you want to feel joy, it's tied into the concept of, if you want to feel joy is if you want to feel grateful, that's the Thanksgiving offering. If you want to feel grateful, you have to feel joy. If you want to feel joy, you have to transcend the self, you have to connect to others. So the inviting of the neighbors, of the friends and family to celebrate together is an expression of joy, but it will also elicit joy, because when I connect to others, I will feel happy, right? Sometimes I'm not in the mood. I'm not feeling joyous. I want to stay in bed. Someone tells me, go out, go see people. You go see people, automatically you come back, you feel happier. How does that work? Because when you see people, you're transcending yourself. You're having a relationship with somebody else. If you have a relationship with someone else, your soul feels free. Your soul feels happy. So the point is, the theme of gratitude brings joy. And joy can only happen when you transcend the self. And therefore, these three concepts are related. So God is telling you, you want to be grateful for the miracle. You feel grateful. Gratefulness brings about joy. And joy must bring about connecting to others. Hence the 40 loaves of bread that are eaten together with the Thanksgiving offering, and hence the shrinking of the time of eating the Thanksgiving offering. In one day, you have to eat all that food because you have to invite others, because joy can never be celebrated alone. Like I said, many people confuse pleasure and joy. They're two different feelings, and pleasure could be experienced alone, but joy cannot. Because we're approaching Passover, we want to connect this notion to Passover as well. But before we do that, maybe I'll open up the floor. Maybe somebody wants to say something. Okay, if anybody wants to jump in.
Quick question.
Yes.
I thought there was a commandment not to eat skin of an animal.
Not to eat skin of the animal.
But there was a negative commandment about that. I know blood, you're not supposed to eat the blood of an animal.
Yeah, there's certain parts of the animal you cannot eat, mostly fats of the animal. The skin, you can't really eat the skin, but that you can, I don't know of such a commandment.
Like that chicken, for a chicken, you shouldn't eat the skin out of it.
No, there's no such commandment, no. Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
Rabbi,
Yes.
could you give us the definition of the difference between joy and pleasure? My assumption is that joy is spiritual, pleasure is not necessarily, or perhaps definitely not necessarily spiritual. So could you clarify that distinction?
Yes, I think pleasure in the Kabbalistic definition, pleasure could be spiritual, and pleasure really is a good thing. And pleasure is not, when I say pleasure could be experienced alone, I don't mean pleasure is a bad thing. Pleasure is a good thing. If you read King David's book of Psalms, he keeps saying the term "V'hita'aneg al Hashem." A person should have pleasure from the relationship with God. Okay, so pleasure is a wonderful thing. If you find your pleasure in negative places, that's negative. But pleasure per se is actually holy, and there's a big debate in the Kabbalah: what is deeper, will or pleasure? That mostly we come up with the conclusion. In other words, the conclusion is that in fact pleasure is the deepest part of the soul. So let's not put down pleasure. However, pleasure means soul returning to self. Pleasure is soul returning to self.
You're unmuted.
Okay.
Pleasure is soul returning to self when your soul turns inward. And joy is when the soul flows outward. So that's a whole subject. We can talk about it for an hour. I don't want to elaborate too much, but I'll just say one thing. The feeling of pleasure, if you think about it, if you close your eyes and think about what is pleasurable, you would see, I think you'll agree with me that pleasure comes along with the feeling that at this moment, I don't need anything. I am complete. Right? So let's say I'm sitting on my yacht. I don't have a yacht, but let's say I'm sitting on my yacht drinking a beer or coffee or scotch. And I look out my window and I see, hey, the guy next to me has a bigger yacht than I have. Right? I'm not enjoying pleasure. That's not pleasure. Because pleasure means when you really experience pleasure, you would feel that you have everything you need. You are complete. You're touching the part of soul that is complete. If I feel like I'm not complete, it's a wonderful thing. That's will, that's longing, that's yearning, but it's not pleasure. So pleasure is I touch the part of myself that I am complete within myself. So that's, again, something to contemplate. I don't know if here's the time. But that's different than flowing. That's the soul flowing inward. Joy is the soul trying to flow outward. It cannot be contained within itself. It's dancing. When people feel pleasure, they don't dance. When they're happy, they dance. What's dance? Dance is I lift myself up. I can't be contained in my seat because my soul is flowing outward. Pleasure, I'm sitting on the couch, flowing inward. So the image of somebody feeling pleasure is someone sitting on the couch or sitting on the beach chair or sitting on the yacht because it's flowing inward. Joy is the opposite. I'm flowing outward. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
An addendum to the point where you're talking about the lamb and 40 loaves of bread. Did you invite your neighbors over?
Yes.
There's an addendum to that. You're also doing charity because you're giving to the needy some food. So it's in addition to the joy you feel with sharing your food, you're also giving the act of charity.
Correct. However, I would say in the Torah, there are many laws about charity in the Torah, and there are many different forms of charity in the Torah. There is charity giving from 10% of your produce, et cetera, et cetera. But with the law of the Thanksgiving offering, you don't necessarily have to give it to the poor. You can give it to the rich. It doesn't matter who you give it to. The point is, you got to go beyond the self to experience joy. And again, if you have to make a soundbite out of this and say, what's the key to experiencing joy? The answer that the Torah is giving here is you have to climb out of yourself. You have to escape the confines of self. How do you escape the confines of self? By giving to somebody else, not by giving to the poor necessarily. The point is relationship with somebody else, whether rich, whether poor. There's something else, which is to give charity, which is a wonderful thing, which is a great mitzvah. But the key to feeling thankful, the key to feeling joyous is go beyond yourself. Pick up the phone, pick up the Skype, pick up the Zoom, whatever platform you're invested in, and connect to somebody else. Not now. Now you have to stay home. But in general, the concept of relating to other people, escaping the confines of self, is the best way. Is the only way to joy.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to relate this all back to Passover, and then we'll call it a day because we have a lot of work to do. We have to light the fire. We have to create the passion. We have to not be limited by yesterday's ashes, by yesterday's accomplishments. We have to value the longing in the love, because the bitterness that's within the longing actually could communicate a tremendous growth, could fuel tremendous growth. And then we have to feel thankful. We have to transcend the self and feel thankful. We have a lot to do. So I'm going to take another few minutes, and then we'll let everybody go and build their own temple in their own life.
We have to eat 40 loaves of bread. That's going to take some.
That's true. That's
No, you're sharing them.
true. Good point. I forgot.
You got to find
You
40
can hear them. That's right. Okay. You have to find neighbors. Yes. Okay. So let me. I'm just going to mute so we can hear, and then we'll continue. Okay. Let's go back to the Passover Seder for a minute, just to make the connection with the concept of Thanksgiving, the concept of transcending self, the concept of giving to others. So there's a very strange ritual we do during the Seder. We do this as soon as we begin to tell the story. So if you're following the Seder and you're doing it in the traditional form, first thing you're doing is you're doing kiddush, kadesh, you're making the kiddush, then you're washing your hands, then you're dipping the vegetable, then you're breaking the matzah, then you start telling the story. What happens when you start telling the story? So in most traditional Haggadahs, that's when you make a declaration. You say, hey, Lachma Anya, this is the blood of affliction. And then you make a declaration. You ready for the declaration? The declaration is, anybody who's hungry should come join my Passover Seder. Wonderful declaration. It's actually very inspiring that you're so generous. You're inviting everybody to your Seder. The problem is that isn't it a little bit too late, right? Everybody's already sitting at the Seder. No one's hearing your declaration. It's like the guy who comes home, locks the door, and says, whoever wants to come for dinner, come for dinner. No. If you really wanted people to come for dinner, you would, earlier in the synagogue or earlier, you would put out a Facebook post and say, whoever wants to come for dinner, come for dinner. What is this idea that we come into our home, we sit down, and we actually start the meal? In other words, we make the kiddush, we start the Seder, and then in the sort of the middle of the Seder, we say, oh, anybody who actually needs a Seder, please come to my house. It seems like totally wrong. It's not the right place for this. You're not really sincere by inviting people because there's no one to invite at this point of the game. You're not even inviting people at the beginning of the meal. You're inviting people once you're a few steps into the Seder. So it's very strange. So the Hasidic interpretation that Rebbe taught this is actually absolutely unbelievable. He said as follows. He says, the purpose of this invitation is not to invite people. Presumably you invited people earlier in the day. This is sort of a reiterating the invitation. What do I mean? So I mean as follows. When somebody is trapped, right, think about Passover. Passover is the road to, is the concept of freedom and also spiritual freedom. So the idea of Passover is sort of the roadmap to spiritual freedom. So how do you define spiritual freedom? So as long as a person is trapped within the confines of self, as long as a person is trapped within worrying just about themselves, they're not free. They're sort of, they are confined by their own ego. They're trapped by their own ego. Freedom is transcendence. Transcendence is going beyond self. So here's what the Rebbe said. I invited the guest. I have my table is full of guests, but I don't really care about the guest, or I don't really feel the pain of the guest. I feel myself. That's the natural state of the human being. So I make the kiddush. I wash my hands. I dip the vegetable. And here, then the next step is I touch the matzah. I touch the matzah and I cut the matzah in half. What happens when I touch the matzah? So we discussed on Tuesday that matzah represents humility. Matzah represents the ability to see beyond myself. So matzah had this magical effect on me. I took the message of matzah to heart, and all of a sudden, I'm free of the confines of self, which means I feel the pain of somebody else. Now I say, whoever needs food, please come to my table. I'm not just talking to the people who are not in my house. I'm also talking to the poor people who are already at my house. Because all of a sudden it hit me that there are other people, and other people have different perspectives, and other people may be in pain, and other people may be needy. I mean, I knew about it earlier, but it didn't resonate with me because I was too busy thinking about self. And what the matzah does for me, what spiritual freedom does for me, it allows me to transcend the perspective of self. And all of a sudden I say, wow, there actually somebody else may have a need. Oh, that's news to me. That is the moment of freedom. When are you free? You're free when you're willing to share your bread. When are you free? When you're willing to feel the pain of somebody else. Otherwise, you're trapped within the confines of self. And that's the connection between the idea of the Thanksgiving offering, where you have to invite other people. And what that does for you is that it allows you to escape the confines of self and experience the joy. But what it also does for you, it also frees you. Because when a person is trapped by the ego is the biggest oppressor. The ego is the biggest pharaoh. Like we said on Tuesday, the ego does not allow me to take risk. It doesn't allow me to try new things. It doesn't allow me to go beyond my comfort zone because my ego is afraid that it has to protect itself. It's afraid of failure. It's afraid of rejection. If I can get myself out of the perspective of the ego, I could be free. And the first byproduct of that is, oh, there are other people. Oh, there are people that may be suffering. Oh, there are other people that may be experiencing pain. So the concept of freedom is the ability to see beyond self. The true free person could see beyond themselves. And that is why only once I touch the matzah, once I internalize the message of the matzah, now I could start feeling the pain of the other. So yes, I put the post on Facebook, I invited guests, but do I really feel connected to my guests? That can only happen once I achieve the freedom. That can only happen once I internalize the message of the matzah. Okay, so enough said for one day. I'm going to open up the floor, and everybody could jump in. And after that, everybody have a wonderful day, and everybody should get ready for Passover, both physically and spiritually. And most important thing is joy and connecting to others.
Rabbi, can I ask you something about joy?
Yes.
Can joy also be feeling the joy of someone else rather than necessarily suffering of someone else?
Yes. In fact, people would say, it was a question, I don't know who asked the question, but when we were young, we were asked the question of what is it easier? Is it easier to feel the pain of someone else or to feel the joy of someone else? And I don't know who told me this question, who gave me the answer. And I don't know if what he said is true, but the way I remember when I was a young person, they told me it's actually harder to feel the joy. To be happy for someone else is harder than to feel pain for someone else. Someone got hit by a car. I feel bad for you. But someone else got the promotion that I wanted. Someone else got the opportunity I wanted. Oh, that is much harder to connect to. But if you could feel the joy for somebody else, then you're more free. That's the true sign of freedom, that you can feel not only the pain of somebody else, but also the joy of someone else. So I would argue that the beginning of the Seder, the beginning of the process of freedom is sensing the pain of other people. But then when you grow in your freedom, then you can connect to the joy of other people. That's a higher step. Perhaps. I may be wrong, perhaps.
No, you're right.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have a question.
Sure.
Since part of Passover is sharing and inviting and bringing people into your home, like what would the Rebbe say about this year's Passover? Or like what would you advise? Because obviously we can't do that.
This year's Passover is very problematic because it's we are a religion. We are a religion. We're not built to be alone. Everybody wants to know, unfortunately, why the Hasidic community is getting hit so hard, and it's by this disease, and it's by this virus. And it's not a joke. I can't tell you how many people I know who have passed away in the last week and a half. It's absolutely frightening. But what I'm trying to say here is it's the Hasidic community and the Judaism really it's not a religion meant to be practiced alone. It's all about connecting to other people. But this year we have to focus on the other aspect that we discussed last week. You have the opportunity to look inward. In other words, we discussed this, that this connecting to others, but then maybe this is a signal from God that this year, we have to internalize these messages, and in some cases, we have to do this alone. We have to work within ourselves. Once we work within ourselves, then we could then bring the inspiration to others. So there's nothing wrong with at this year focusing on the self, focusing on the personal growth within my own home. That's one answer. Another answer is that sometimes they say it's much easier to help someone in the other side of the world. Sometimes it's much harder to be charitable to people closest to me. So I'm very happy to help other people, very happy to help the poor. But do I have the opportunity to give my child or my spouse the attention that they need? Not always, right? So sometimes connecting to the other doesn't have to mean the other who's someone living at a different address. Sometimes it's someone living in my own home with a different perspective. So there is plenty. So in other words, even in this scenario where we're moving inward, we're in our home, we're focusing on self, trying to internalize these concepts so that later we'll be able to come out of isolation and be in a better position to help and inspire others. That's point one. But point two is even within that circumstance, I am in isolation. There are other people here in isolation with me. This is an opportunity to connect to them. And I almost feel bad to say this because of all the suffering in the world right now and suffering in my community right now and in all the communities right now. I almost feel bad to say this, but there's a certain beauty for me sitting in my house with my children and my wife for 3 weeks straight. I never had this in my life. We're not running. There's no carpool. We don't have to meet any deadlines. It's like living in paradise. So of course there's a tremendous amount of pain, but there is an opportunity to connect to others in a way, in a closer circle to oneself, in a way that's unprecedented. I never experienced this in my entire life. So we have to also see the opportunity within this scenario to be able to connect deeply to those closest to us, which sometimes is even harder than to connect to those in the external circles.
Rabbi, will you be doing something like this on Passover for us? Will you be connecting to 40 of us?
So we don't do Zoom on Passover because of the laws. Once the sun sets, we don't do it. But the plan is, I do hope to put out there, we did the 2 classes we did 1 class on Passover meditations, and we're going to do another one on Tuesday. But I do hope for this year to put out a few short meditations, maybe 1 or 2 minutes a piece, about the various themes of Passover, because if I feel like if I put it out in a shorter version, it'd be easier for people to internalize and also to repeat at their own Passover Seder. So look out for it. I'm going to try to do, 4 or 5 of them, maybe put one out a day, or maybe put them all out together. But I'm going to try to give sort of 4, 5, 6 meditations that in short form that people would be able to use for their Seder, and hopefully that would help people make it meaningful for them.
Thank you.